Hello everyone, what is up? It is me, MTG. For today's video, Wizards of the Coast released yesterday the first set of data for Guilds of Ravnica Standard based on Magic the Gathering Online Competitive Standard League. So, for today's video, we'll be going and talking about some of the decks that went 5-0 undefeated in some of these competitive standard leagues on Magic the Gathering Online. This has been one of the most successful series here on my channel, so hopefully you guys will enjoy this one as you guys have enjoyed the previous ones before. If you guys are new to the series, I generally like to talk about 8 undefeated decks that went undefeated 5-0 in these competitive standard leagues. We try to talk about decks that are not just the same deck over and over again. We try to hit a decent variety of different decks, possibly get a little feel for what we could see in the metagame, and maybe give you guys a little bit of an idea for what standard deck you might want to build for the Guilds of Ravnica season. It should be a fun time, and so without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into the first deck, Boros Agro. Based on what I saw from the data, Boros appeared to be the deck that the most people were trying. There was different variations of Boros. There was like your basic Boros Agro list, which is what I'm putting up here. There was also a Boros Goblins list, as well as a Boros Angels list. Both of those basically just kind of did the same sort of thing. It basically just varied in the Goblins list was more Goblin-centric, of course, and then ran white for things like Conclave Tribunal and Radiant Destiny, and the Angels list was trying to go a little bit bigger than their opponents, running cards like Aurelia, Lyra, and then focusing on some of the Angel synergies as well. For this one here, though, this is just kind of your more basic Boros Aggro list. You're playing low-to-the-ground creatures, things like Dauntless Bodyguard, good aggressive creatures like Boros Challenger. Cavalry Drillmaster is a very aggressive creature, 2 mana, 2/1, giving +2/+0 in first strike. And then we also see some new additions here from Guilds of Ravnica, cards like Swiftblade Vindicator, a 1/1 with double strike, vigilance, and trample. We see Tajic Legion's Edge, which is a nice one here as well. 3 mana for a 3/2 haste, mentor, prevent all non-combat damage that would be dealt to other creatures you control. And then for 2 mana, you can give it first strike until end of turn. So a good little card here in Tajic, and it is running 4 copies of Tajic despite it being legendary. So that's how you know Tajic is one of the more key pieces to these Boros Aggro decks. And then at the 2-drop slot, I've seen a lot of people trying to play 4 Aurelia. This list is only playing 1, and so it's kind of nice seeing that this list was successful even without the 4 Aurelias. A lot of the people that I've been seeing, streaming and testing these Boros Aggro decks have been playing 4 Aurelia just right away. Like the first 4 cards they add to the deck is 4 Aurelia because they just want to play with this new Angel. This person, you guys can see up here, this is the person who went and played the league with the deck. So Jake Dersheimer, I assume is how this would be pronounced. He was the person who went undefeated with this deck. So he's only playing 1 Aurelia here, and instead actually playing multiple copies of a different 4-drop, going with 2 Ajani, Adversary of Tyrants as well. Helps him return some of the different creatures. And then he's also playing one of the split cards, Integrity to Intervention, which I brought up here on Scryfall, and I need to rotate it. There we go. So you can see here, target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn for 1 mana, and then for 4 mana you get a Lightning Helix, deals 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life. So a very aggressive card, also gives the deck a little bit of reach as well by having this ability to just go Lightning Helix to the dome if necessary. And then another thing I just wanted to touch on very quickly is Hunted Witness in this deck. I thought Hunted Witness was a little bit awkward in this deck when I first saw it, but it turns out it's actually just like a reasonable card. It's another 1-drop to make your Boros Challenger significantly better, because there aren't that many cards that you're playing that actually have 1 power or less for the Boros Challenger to mentor onto. So the Hunted Witness as well as the Hunted Witness token are good little cards for you to be able to use the mentor triggers on from Boros Challenger. And then your other big target is the Swiftblade Vindicator as well, since it's a 1/1. That's a good little card to put your +1/+1 counter on as well. So basic stuff here, just a nice little Boros Aggro deck, and then in the sideboard you can see some new cards as well. Justice Strike, a nice little removal spell here, and Deafening Clarion, a way to deal with some of the smaller creatures, as well as giving your creatures lifelink. So good little card there. And also Experimental Frenzy, this is another card that a lot of people were testing in their main boards. It's really only good against the control matchups from what I've seen, because it makes it so that their cards like Chemist's Insight and their other draw spells, like maybe Teferi as well, are a little bit less good, or significantly less good in the case of something like Chemist's Insight. But yeah, it seems to be quite good in the control matchup, but not so good in the aggressive mirrors. It feels a little bit awkward if you're playing the Boros mirror and you're stuck with Experimental Frenzy Frenzy and your opponent doesn't have one, you can still both kind of play around it. It's fairly easy to play around in those kind of decks, not so easy in the control decks. So I like having Experimental Frenzy here on the sideboard instead of the main board like most people were testing with. Onto the second deck here, we're looking at a white-green tokens convoke sort of strategy here. The big card here being Tristani Discordant, one of the new cards from Guilds of Ravnica. Very similar to Regal Caracal, and we saw Regal Caracal put up a bunch of success in the past when Amonkhet was legal, and so Tristani Discordant does kind of the same thing, except other creatures you control get +1/+1, so it works very well with cards that are trying to go a little bit more wide, which is why we see things like 4 copies of Sackburling Migration to try and make 2 1/1s for 2 mana, or possibly 4 1/1s for 6 mana as well if the game goes a little bit later, and then March for the Multitudes as well to make a bunch of 1/1s. You're also playing Legion's Landing as the only 1-drop in the deck, another way to just make a token that you can eventually use as a thing that you can convoke with, and then 3 copies of Amara, which again is a great card to convoke with as well because you can make the other soldier token. And then kind of your big payoffs aside from the Tristani Discordant, the other big payoff is Venerated Loxodon. I talked about this card a little bit, how it kind of reminds me of playing out similar to something like Verdurous Gearhulk, where you're putting a bunch of +1/+1 counters on your creatures for a low number of mana. It does feel worse than Verdurous Gearhulk, but Verdurous Gearhulk was a very good card. But Venerated Loxodon actually does have the ability to put more to distribute more power and toughness than Verdurous Gearhulk did have. This could end up distributing 9 power and toughness worth of power and toughness. I believe I already said that, but oh well, you guys know what I mean. And Verdurous Gearhulk could only do 8. You could do 5/1, or it came in as a 4/4, and then you could distribute 4 +1/+1 counters. Venerated Loxodon, if you have it come in as a 4/4 and then convoke it by tapping 5 of your creatures to put +1/+1 counters on them, that's a total of 9 power and 9 toughness, which is 1 more than Verdurous Gearhulk. So it doesn't allow you to attack right away like Verdurous Gearhulk would allow you to, where you could just put the counters on a smaller creature, get in with a bigger creature, then put 3 counters on your land or elves, attack for 4 right away. Venerated Loxodon can't quite do the same, which is why Gearhulk is better. But it is a card that you want to keep in mind if you're possibly thinking about making some convoke strategies here in the near future. And then aside from that, everything else is pretty regular here. Shalai, Voice of Plenty, is just a fantastic card in this deck as well. Works very nice at protecting your creatures, and also has the ability to work well with the go wide strategy as well by putting +1/+1 counters on each of your creatures. And then in the sideboard, we're seeing the new card Knight of Autumn show up. This card is fantastic, and a good little sideboard card here for a deck like this. I've also seen many decks testing it in the main board as well, just because it does so much, and it's a very versatile card. Onto the next deck, we're going to take a look at Jess Guy Control from Hades Blade. This one is it seems like it's trying to metagame the first week of play for a new standard format. So most of the time when a new standard format comes out, what ends up happening is creature decks will run rampant because the control decks don't really know what answers they're supposed to have in their decks quite yet. And then later on, like maybe give it 2-3 weeks after the set is released, and then you'll see the control decks knowing what cards they're supposed to have, what counter spells they're supposed to prioritize the most, those kind of things. And so that's really where you'll end up seeing the control deck start to shine. But for this deck, it basically just ran a bunch of spells that care about killing creatures, and because of that was able to kind of prey upon the creature decks that are running rampant here in the first week of play. Shivan Fire deals with creatures, Disdainful Stroke deals with bigger creatures, Essence Scatter deals with creatures, Justice Strike creatures, Lava Coil creatures, Lightning Strike creatures, Deafening Clarion creatures. Ionize deals with everything, so that's fine. Chemist's Insight, I guess it's a draw spell, doesn't really deal with creatures. 3 Settle the Wreckage deals with creatures, Cleansing Nova deals with creatures, and then the big win condition here is Expansion Explosion. I believe I have this one open over here. Let me rotate it again as well. So Expansion Explosion here, the expansion side being 2 mana, copy target instant or sorcery spell with converted mana cost 4 or less. You may choose new targets for the copy. And then Explosion is a card that a lot of people have been comparing to Sphinx's Revelation. X blue red for an instant deals X damage to any target. Target player deals X cards. So Explosion is much better at closing out the game in comparison to In comparison to Sphinx's Revelation, it can really turn the corner quite fast, while Sphinx's Revelation was a card that could help you stay alive longer with your control deck. So it is interesting to see Explosion here as the main win condition in this deck. Aside from that, one copy of Ralzeric, the -3 is fantastic because it deals damage to target creature equal to the total number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. And you can see with 26 spells in this deck, it's quite obvious that there's going to be many spells in the graveyard to work very well with Ralzeric. The other thing I really want to point out for this deck is that it's running 28 lands, which is quite a lot of lands. But I guess if you're planning on ditching lands to Chemister's Insight and you're planning on playing so many 5-drops, Cleansing Nova, Triple Teferi, 1 Ralzeric, actually that's not even that many 5-drops to want to play 28 lands, but you're also playing a giant X spell as your win condition, so of course you want to have lands to be able to put into that so that the X can be quite large on that. But very interesting here, seeing 28 lands coming from this list, and then the sideboard is just again kind of your basic stuff in case he does, or in case who was the person that did this, Hades Blade was to go up against a control matchup. There's a few things here in the sideboard: Negate, another search for Azcanta. Invoke the Divine, possibly some more draw spells here, and then some other threats that he can potentially put in, like Nezahal as well. So this deck feels like it's kind of preying upon the creature decks. Good little meta call for the first week of play, which is kind of an interesting thing to say because normally the meta is not defined by the first week, but this person knew what the meta was going to be like and kind of preyed upon it. So very, very nice by Hades Blade here. The next one is Golgari Graveyard. This deck is super sweet, and I think this is the first one I'm going to test with when I get the opportunity to do so. It's kind of like a turbo graveyard strategy deck where you're playing cards like Stitcher Supplier to help get cards into your graveyard, and then eventually you're also playing Glowspore Shaman as well, gets more cards in your graveyard, and eventually you're going to use good graveyard cards to just win the game. Izoni Thousand Eyes, you're playing a bunch of creatures, you can go very wide with this card. With the Undergrowth trigger, make a bunch of 1/1s and then just beat your opponent that way. It's also possible to use the Eldritch Reborn as a way to return one of the powerful creatures from your graveyard back to the battlefield. Even Vraska as well, since it can return a Planeswalker in case you mill over a Vraska. And then you can also use Find to Finality, which is, again, another split card here. You can see Find, let me scroll up a little bit here. You can see Find is 2 mana to return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. And then Finality is 6 mana. You may put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature you control. Then all creatures get -4/-4 until end of turn. So what Find to Finality is really doing is, in this deck, is in case you mill over something like your Doom Whisperer, which of course we know is going to be a powerful card, or in case you mill over something like your Izoni Thousand Eyes, you can go ahead and bring them back using the Find side of Find a Finality, and then get more value out of them later in the game. And then if for some reason, your strategy just isn't working, your creatures aren't, sticking as they should be, but your opponent still has some smaller creatures, then you still have the Finality side as well to just kind of clear the board, reset things a little bit, and give you some more time to try and draw into cards like your Izoni and then some of the other stuff. And then it just has a few cards that just kind of work well with the strategy. It's playing some Mana Dorks. Llanowar Elves is in the deck. Druid of the Cowl is in the deck. And then Elvish Rejuvenator is in the deck as well as ways to find lands, because you really want to get your Izoni Thousand Eyes as the big win condition here. You're really going to want that 6 mana to be able to possibly play this on curve, and it should be a very, very large number of 1/1s that you're creating with Izoni because of the turbo graveyard strategy going along with 29 creatures. So very sweet deck here, as well as 3 Plaguecrafter in the sideboard. This will be the last card we talk about for this deck. Plaguecrafter is the new Fleshbag Marauder, so it's 2 colorless and a black for a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. Each player who can't discards a card. So if they end up only playing 1 creature, then it just removes that creature. If they end up playing something like the Teferi deck that we talked about earlier, this deck, then most of the time, if they tap out for Teferi, leave up 2 mana, but don't have something to deal with it, like maybe they're leaving up the Disdainful Stroke, for example, then the Plaguecrafter can come down and actually force them to sacrifice the Teferi, which is a huge tempo swing in your favor, which is super, super nice. Onto deck number 5, this is Grixis Control. So we're seeing some of the good Surveil cards, or some of the good blue-black cards in general here from Guilds of Ravnica showing up. Thought Erasure is a card that I thought would show up a lot more than it did, but again, just a fantastic card here. Surveil 1, and then target, or I guess you do it first and then you Surveil, but target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, that player discards that card. This deck is also splashing red for Nicol Bolas, because Nicol Bolas is a very powerful card. We're seeing Dream Eater show up here from Guilds of Ravnica, one of the new big finishers in this deck. And then something else I also wanted to point out in this deck was the decision to run Bone Dragon over Doom Whisperer. I think that that's kind of interesting, choosing Bone Dragon over Doom Whisperer, especially because of all the hype around Doom Whisperer right now. I feel like most people would, just slot Doom Whisperer into that slot, but this individual, AVB, decided to go with Bone Dragon, and it looks like it worked out quite well. And then Notion Rain here, the new Read the Bones, showing up in this deck as well. Very nice card, and especially because you're running so few threats here. You only have the 8 creatures, but then you also have the Eldritch Reborn as well, which is another way to get a threat eventually as well. And then Ritual of Soot is another card that's showing up here as well. Destroy all creatures with converted mana cost 3 or less. Works out perfectly in this deck because you're not playing anything CMC 3 or less, so it's basically just a wrath for their side of the board instead of yours, especially if you're against the smaller creature decks. Can be a little bit awkward, again, if you're against the control decks, but a lot of people wanted to prey on the creature decks, since the creature decks are what's really showing up here in week 1 of the standard meta, so Ritual of Soot was a nice little main board card here for this Grixis control list, or I guess this blue-black control list, splashing red for Nicol Bolas. Onto the next deck, we're looking at good old Mono Red. Mono Red has survived through rotation. We weren't sure how it was going to be after seeing cards like Bomat Courier and Earthshaker Kenra rotating, but Mono Red is certainly alive and still running. This one being a very aggressive version, running 3 copies of the Flame of Keld, and then the big key piece that this deck has gotten was the Runaway Steamkin. This can be an easy 2-mana 5/5 in this deck, which is very nice and aggressive. As well as has the ability to pump out some additional mana if you needed to do that here too. And then it's just playing a bunch of very aggressive creatures. Viashino Pyromancer, we already know, nice and aggressive. Chain Whirler, we already know, nice and aggressive. Firebrand, nice and aggressive. And then it's even aggressive enough to be running Risk Factor. Target opponent may have Risk Factor, deal 4 damage to them. If that player doesn't, you draw 3 cards. So it is a Punisher card. It gives your opponent a choice to do one of these 2 things that they would rather not have happen. But it does have Jumpstart, which is kind of nice. So you have the ability to recur it late in the game. The deck is running 22 Mountains. So that gives you a land that you can potentially throw away later on. You're not playing anything higher than 3 CMC, so it is likely that later on in the game you'll draw a land that you won't need, and then you can go ahead and pitch that land to jumpstart the risk factor, which is quite nice. And then I also just like how consistent this deck looks, or I guess not even consistent, but everything here is just like 4 ofs or 3 ofs. There's nothing less than a 4 of or 3 of, which is very nice. For the creature base, 5/4 of creatures. Spells, you're looking at 4 ofs except for Wizard's Lightning, which is a 3 of. Enchantments, 4 of, except Flame of Keld being a 3 of instead. So it's just very this person knew what cards they wanted for this particular archetype and then went with those cards. Didn't mess around with all of these new fancy cards, trying out different things and that kind of stuff. He just went very streamlined and was like, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to try and beat my opponent as fast as I can. These are the best cards that allow me to do it, and I'm going to go for it. So in the sideboard here you can see some new cards as well. Lava Coil here from Guilds of Ravnica, again helping deal with some of the creatures that could possibly ruin the day for this mono red deck, since it doesn't really have anything to deal 4 damage. So if they go up against some sort of like X4, for example, it pretty much just shuts down the entire deck if Lava Coil is not there. Fight with Fire, again another spell that can help bring down some of the creatures that are 4 toughness or greater, in this case 5 toughness or greater. And then Legion Warboss, again another good card from Guilds of Ravnica that can help you just end the game quite quickly. Onto the next deck, we're looking at Mono Blue Tempo. This is a deck that kind of emerged towards the end. Ken Yukihiro played it at Worlds, and the big pieces that it lost were Slitherblades. You used to be able to run the 8 unblockable package, 4 Slitherblade, 4 Mistcloak Herald. You can no longer run Slitherblade because it rotated out. And so the only new card that we're actually seeing from Guilds of Ravnica in this list is Nightveil Sprite. 2 mana evasive creature. When it attacks, you get a little bit of a benefit. You get to surveil 1. But the main thing I want to talk about in this deck is how we're seeing different iterations of this build now that you can no longer play with some of the cards that have rotated out. So, for example, in this deck, we're seeing Exclusion Mage, which is something we didn't really see in these lists before. So Exclusion Mage starting to see a little bit of play, and then because you're adding 2 additional wizards to the deck, it allows you to move all the way up to 4 Wizards Retort. There are 14, I believe, wizards in this deck, 4 Siren Storm Tamer, 4 Merfolk Trickster, and 2 Exclusion Mage, so I guess maybe it's 10. Yeah, 10 wizards, but it allows you to go up to 4 Wizards Retort in the deck, which is quite different compared to what we were seeing before. The list that I saw before were more of 2 or 3, but this one just went all the way up to 4 because of the additional wizards being added in. So again, this is an archetype that has survived if you were playing this, before, or if you're looking to get into a budget deck. This one's very cheap, $30, $7.50. This is a deck that put up some good results last time and has managed to survive through rotation with just a few changes being made to it. So very good deck here in Mono Blue Tempo. And onto the final deck for the video, Steel Leaf Stompy. This one is basically just kind of what we've seen before from the previous Steel Leaf Stompy decks, but they did make some changes because some cards rotated out. The big additions, the big additions to this deck are the Pelt Collector, which is another 1-drop, so now you have 8 1-drops for the Steel Leaf Stompy deck, which is much better, I think, than just the 4 Llanowar Elves that we saw previously. We're also seeing the addition of 4 Nullhide Ferox being added to the deck, a 4-mana 6/6. And you're basically playing no non-creature spells. The only non-creature spells you're playing are 3 Assassin's Trophy. We saw this in the past with mono-green Stompy decks where they would splash black for Hour of Glory because it was an answer to cards like the Scarab God and other creatures that were just pretty difficult for the Steel Leaf Stompy decks to deal with. Assassin's Trophy basically does the same thing, except it'll deal with permanents instead of just creatures. So this list is running 3 Assassin's Trophy main board, and then also an additional Assassin's Trophy in the sideboard. And then because it's running the black cards in the main board, you're also seeing some additional black sources being added. Before, you mainly just saw the 4 Woodland Cemetery and maybe 1 Swamp for the Scrapheap Scrounger activations, and then the Hour of Glories in the sideboard. But now that you're playing the black cards in the main board, you're seeing 4 Overgrown Tomb here, as well as 4 Woodland Cemetery and even a Swamp. So now there's 9 black sources in the deck compared to 4 that we saw previously. So it'll be much more consistent in terms of the black splash, which is why they also added additional black cards to the sideboard, 3 Duress, the additional Assassin's Trophy like I mentioned, and then a Vraska Relic Seeker as well. But aside from that, everything else is pretty much just stock from what we had seen before. Llanowar Elves into Steel Leaf Champion is what you're hoping for, and then now you can go turn 4 Nullhide Ferox into, or turn 4 Vinemare. But yeah, I think this deck looks sweet. Again, this is another one I'm definitely going to want to test out. The deck seems super sweet, and I had some success with the mono green Stompy list in the past, so I'll probably be trying this one as well. So again, we'll go through each deck really quickly. We're talking about Boros Agro, white-green. This was the Jeskai Control list. This one here being the Golgari Graveyard strategy, Grixis Control, Mono Red, Mono Blue Tempo, as well as Steel Leaf Stompy. Those are the 8 decks we talked about in this video. If you guys did enjoy the video and you found it to be informative, be sure to leave a like on the video and let me know what you guys were thinking about all of these decks down low in the comment section. Love hearing from you guys. Which of these decks do you think has the chance to, go ahead and be the best deck in this current format? I think all of these decks have a lot of potential, and there are even more decks for us to talk about, so I'll probably end up making a second video later on. Maybe give it a week or so, and then I'll make the second video. We'll get some new deck lists and things like that, and I'll definitely make a second video. Should be a lot of fun. This format seems like it's going to be great. Can't wait to give it a try, and yeah, it's going to be a good standard format from what I can see so far. So I'm very excited, and hopefully you guys are too. With that being said, hopefully you guys enjoy the video, and I'll see you guys here next time for another Magic the Gathering video. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video where we talk about some of the undefeated deck lists from day one of Guilds of Ravnica Standard. Hopefully you guys did enjoy it. At the end of all of my videos, I love to give a huge shout out and thank you to my patrons over on the Patreon page. So huge shout out and thank you to Jeremy, Jason, Jayathi Swaran, Daniel, and Battle of MTG. They're supporting me over on the Patreon page. I'm extremely appreciative, and hopefully you guys did enjoy the video. Hopefully my patrons enjoyed the video, and yeah, more Guilds of Ravnica content coming here in the near future. Hopefully you guys are excited for that as well. And I'll see you guys here next time.